A city of palm trees and sirens, badges in the dark, a unit built to hunt sets that started moving like one, whispers of skulls and aces, plaques and tattoos, drop talk and courtroom smoke, streets taxed with fear while numbers got counted in back rooms, voices from the hood and the halls both saying the same thing, something was off. Then a wave of names, ink, and headlines turned low rumor into loud thunder. Power looked one way on paper and another way on the block. This is the story of a so-called elite crew that learned the rules of the street too well and made LA bleed for it. Join us as we trace the birth, the code, and the wreckage of the police unit that became a gang. Crash stood for Community Resources Against Street Hoodlums. It was an elite anti-gang setup inside LAPD. The mission sounded clean. Know the sets, learn the nicknames, the habits, the girlfriends, the cars, then shut down drive-bys, robberies, and extortion. Former Chief Daryl Gates said they picked the bravest cops, the ones not scared to mix with the gangsters and push back hard. He believed gang killings dropped from the 1970s into the 1980s. The goal was order. The street said otherwise, and that gap kept growing. Sergeant Brian Liddy broke it down simple. Crash had two lanes, intelligence and suppression. On the intel side, you live in the gang's world daily. You map the cliques, the leaders, the shooters, the hustles. On suppression, you roll through and stop the damage before it starts. No routine traffic crashes, no domestic calls. You patrol unmarked, you pick targets, you get judged by results. That freedom felt elite. That freedom also cut the leash. What happens when the leash snaps? Liddy said you got assigned to one gang. Call it the ABCs. Your job was to memorize the whole tree. Who is the OG? Who pushes dope? Who boosts cars? Who does robberies? Where they park the ride when the heat is on. They learn you too. They clock your days off. They know if you creep quiet or pull up loud, it becomes a dance on hostile turf. One wrong look and the street explodes. Crash rolled up and the homies came to the window. The talk sounded casual, but it was business. Who shot who? Which hood crossed the line? When is the funeral? Who is paying tax to who? Who is getting pressed on Alvarado? If you sold dope in MacArthur Park and you were not 18th Street, you paid. If not, you got beat or worse. That was the street code. Crash listened, prodded, and took notes. But every convo on the curb carried a risk. Friendly 1 minute, gun drawn the next. Graffiti was the daily paper. Liddy said you could read a block like a headline. Names under a hood's tag meant who was outside last night. Crossed out names could point to fresh beefs. If a red hood got marked out by green, the next night could be an ambush. Sometimes it stayed paint for weeks. Sometimes it turned to bodies in seconds. Crash watched that rhythm. Tag, cross out, tag again. That cycle told the story of who owned the turf, or who was about to try. Liddy pointed to the numbers. Around 1990, Rampart logged about 150 murders. By 1997, he said it was near 33. Parents brought kids back to the park. The boldness faded. Gangs slid to back alleys. Crash claimed a real hit on violence. That was the public face. But there was a darker whisper on the block. Critics said the unit was doing rough justice, harassing the same faces, breaking rules, cooking reports. The badge looked like a set. If that was true, the wins had a price. Inside the unit, the vibe felt special. Unmarked cars, flexible hours, space to choose your moves. There was a logo everyone knew, a white skull and a cowboy hat with the Rampart Castle. 4 cards that made a dead man's hand, aces and eights. It was on shirts and jackets. It looked like a patch a biker would wear. It looked like bragging rights. Liddy said he never knew the whole story until the scandal blew. The streets already had a read on it. It screamed crew. Liddy said LAPD was honest and did not play with guns or probable cause. He denied laying down a strap on suspects. He denied faking PC. He said you did not need to. The crime was sitting right there. Dealers waving baggies, rifles crossing streets in daylight. That was his line. But the streets had another line. They said Crash blurred it, day after day, arrest after arrest. So which story would stand when the heat turned up? The answers started coming from inside. Ruben Rojas, a Temple Street gang member, said Crash moved like a gang itself. He said it was about numbers and bodies off the block, but he also said some officers slid into the life they were hunting. He claimed they would snatch a known fighter and drop him in another hood just to watch a brawl. He said sometimes they bought beer. He told his mom the police did more dirt than he did. His line hit hard. He called them a wannabe mafia. That is not a small charge. Gerald Chalef, the former police commission president, talked about culture. He said Rampart had its own way, a unique population, a unique method. He said that crash units sat in a separate building with the weak supervision. Freedom turned into whatever they wanted. He said when rules and eyes go missing, officers start acting outside the law. It is a simple formula. No boss on the floor, no tight policy, high-pressure streets. The mix can curdle fast, and when it curdles, it spreads. Detective Mike Hohan worked the Rampart Corruption Task Force. He said Rafael Perez described a brutal code. The line was simple: "We intimidate those who intimidate." Hohan said Perez told them crash officers kept drop guns instead of booking them. When they wanted someone locked up, they planted the gun. He said they did the same with rock cocaine. Hold some back. Use it when a case will not stick. That is not policing. That is a setup. And once it starts, it pulls in more people. Hohan also talked about rewards inside the unit. Plaques with aces and eights. Bomber jackets with patches. Tattoos too. If an officer fired and hit a suspect, he got a plaque. Shell casings marked the number of hits. One style for a fatal, another for a wound. Not everyone took part. Some saw it and bounced. But Hohan said it did exist in the unit, and it lived there for a while. A dead man's hand as a trophy. A culture that celebrated hits. What happens when the scoreboard is blood? Critics grew louder after Perez's story hit the light. People said Crash crossed the line again and again. Liddy stood firm on his side. Rojas stood firm on his. Chalif warned about weak oversight. Hohan brought receipts from the task force interviews. 2 worlds, 2 codes, 1 badge. It all pointed to one question hanging over LA. If the hunters start looking like the hunted, who keeps the city safe? And who calls game over? Late afternoon on March 18th, 1997, 2 cops who did not know each other crashed into the same lane in the same rage. Undercover officer Frank Liga said a green SUV pulled up. A driver flashed signs and the tension spiked. The other driver was Kevin Gaines, an off-duty LAPD officer from Rampart. Liga hit his radio with a hidden foot pedal and called it in. He said Gaines rolled up with a .45 and barked, "I'll cap you." Liga fired 2 rounds from his Beretta. One hit Gaines's heart. On TV and in the streets, people called it a racial hit. Liga told Frontline, "In my training experience, this guy had 'I'm a gang member' written all over him." The department paused him on desk duty and dug in. The dig would not end with one shooting. It would pry open a whole set secrets. The internal machine moved fast. 3 separate investigations checked Liga's actions. Detectives also chased the question everyone asked in whispers. Who exactly was Kevin Gaines outside the badge? They said they found a pattern of road rage moves and a gun flash more than once. They also found links to death row records and the off-duty security hustle a lot of cops were running. Rap money, blood ties on the edge, and quiet police muscle standing at studio doors turned into smoke that looked like fire. A lawsuit came next. The Gaines family hired Johnny Cochran and demanded $25 million. The city wrote a check for $250,000 and closed that door, but the hallway behind it was long. Liga was cleared as in policy. The city's power players thought the mess was over. It wasn't. The mess had only learned how to hide in plain sight. That fall, a Bank of America branch got hit for $722,000. It looked tight. It also looked inside. Assistant manager Erilyn Romero ordered more cash than needed just 10 minutes before the stick-up. Some detectives smelled dope through a trunk. Others smelled a setup through a wall. A month later, Romero folded. She said her boyfriend, LAPD officer David Mack, planned the whole thing. Mack, a former track star, got grabbed, tried, and sentenced to 14 years and 3 months. He never gave up the stash spot. In lockup, he bragged he would be rich when he touched daylight. The paper trail showed another thing that made Rampart look sideways. 2 days after the robbery, Mack hit Vegas with 2 cops, one of them a pass, partner named Rafael Perez. Thousands blown on tables. No one said a word that mattered. The city felt the floor start to shake. Detectives kept seeing the same names standing near the same money. Death row records had a habit of hiring off-duty LAPD for security. That check was fat. Names crossed between worlds. Kevin Gaines, David Mack, Rafael Perez, Nino Durden. The image was ugly. Clubs, studios, heavy suits, and the red rag scene moving in the same orbit as the badge. Nobody needed to prove a conspiracy to know the look was bad. People asked who was playing who. Was the record label using the cops, or was the cops' side playing the label? The badge looked less like a shield and more like a pass. Inside Rampart Station, Crash Officer Brian Hewitt brought in an 18th Street member named Ismael Jimenez. The man was cuffed. He was there for questions, not a beating, but Jimenez said Hewitt lit him up. Chest, stomach, hard and mean. He vomited blood. He walked out and went straight to the ER. Hospital staff called it in. Internal Affairs looked. The story matched the damage. The department fired Hewitt. Another officer, Ethan Cohan, got fired for knowing and keeping quiet. Jimenez later copped to federal cases on drugs and a murder conspiracy, but that did not change what happened in the station room. A beating in cuffs is not a gray area. It put a spotlight on Rampart's crash unit at the exact moment when other fires were starting to smoke. The pattern was becoming a picture. In the property room, a different alarm went off. 6 pounds of cocaine were gone. That is not a paperwork error. Detectives backtracked the sign-out slips and saw a fingerprint in ink. Within a week, they were staring at Rafael Perez from Rampart crash. He was not some rookie. He was 9 years in and connected. While they built the case, another audit found 1 more pound missing. That coke had been booked off a prior bust by Frank Liga, the same officer who shot Gaines. The timing made detectives speculate about payback. Whether that motive held or not, the evidence room did not lie. Dope had walked out. Someone had to carry it. Now the scandal had everything a dirty cop story needs to run hot. Money, drugs, and a quiet door in the back where product goes out and nobody talks. Chief Bernard Park saw a pattern and flipped the switch. He formed an internal investigative team in May 1998. It would soon be called the Rampart Corruption Task Force. Their first priority was to nail down the case on Perez. But the task force was not blind to the broader mess. Each thread pulled the same badge. The team started stacking files and chasing every transfer in the evidence system. That is how they found more suspicious signouts and switches, with real cocaine replaced by Bisquick. The old code of silence turned brittle. The more they counted, the more people started to talk when the door was closed. The unit that hunted sets in the street now looked like a set inside the house. And sets, in the end, get pressed. When detectives grabbed Perez on August 25, 1998, he asked a strange question. Is this about the bank robbery? They said no. They were there for the 6 pounds of cocaine that walked out under a fake signature that was, in their words, a dead bang match. The case went to trial in December on charges of possession with intent, grand theft, and forgery. The jury could not land the plane. After 5 days, they hung 8-4 for conviction. While prosecutors geared up for a new run, the task force kept digging. They found 11 more suspect transfers. They mapped out how Perez pulled the dope from property, then swapped it with pancake mix. A cop's job is to build a case. These detectives were building a different one, piece by piece, against a man who once wore the same colors. The switch trick said a lot without a single word from Perez. The weight looks the same to a lazy eye. The paperwork clears. The courtroom never sees the truth. For the task force, that one method proved intent. It was not a slip. It was a system. That is how they set the trap for a deal. Prosecutors knew a mistrial on theft could turn into a confession on something bigger. Crash lived on a scoreboard. This time the score was turning. Either Perez would hold tight and roll the dice again, or he would talk. The department was bleeding trust in the streets and bleeding cases in court. Someone had to flip a door open and let the air in. The next move Perez made pulled the hinges off. Perez pled guilty to the coke theft and cut a deal. 5 years in exchange for truth about 2 bad shootings and 3 other crash officers in illegal work. The fine print mattered. He got immunity for misconduct short of murder. Then he sat down and kept sitting. More than 50 meetings, more than 4,000 pages of sworn statements. He named names. He laid out plays. He said it loud enough for the whole city to hear. This was not one bad apple. He implicated about 70 officers in different levels of dirt, from perjury to drinking on the clock to straight setups. Most of the force had nothing to do with it, but the small circle that did had already poisoned the well. And one of his first bombs was the ugliest. It was about a kid named Javier Ovando who could not walk. Perez said he and his partner Nino Durden shot an unarmed gang member named Javier Ovando in 1996. Then they framed him for attacking them. Ovando got 23 years. He was in a cell, paralyzed, while 2 officers wore the hero jacket off a lie. Perez said Durden came back with a .22 rifle and dropped it next to the bleeding kid. Serial number filed off. It was a planted strap to sell the story. When prosecutors heard that, they moved. They filed a writ to overturn Ovando's conviction. The story cut deep because it was simple. A lie in a uniform pushed a teenager into a chair and a cage. If that one case was like that, how many more? That question became the storm cloud that followed every Rampart case into court. The writ landed. The judge listened. Ovando walked after 2.5 years. He left prison with a broken body and a broken record that the system had to fix on paper. The district attorney's office did not stop there. Based on Perez's statements and the task force checks, nearly 100 more convictions were later overturned. For the men who got out, it was a late truth. For the city, it was a bill. Every vacated case said the same thing. Evidence from certain officers had a stain that would not wash out. A badge carries weight in a courtroom. In Rampart-era cases, that weight started to look like a brick tied to a file. Judges did not want any part of it. The dominoes fell hard and each one made the next easier to push. Chief Parks formed a board of inquiry to do the management autopsy. Command staff dug through how supervision failed and why the culture let dirt grow. When the board released its report in March 2000, it pointed at LAX oversight, weak hiring filters, and training gaps. It listed 108 fixes. On paper, it was a plan to clean house. On the street, people asked if the house would really change. The board's tone felt cautious to critics. They said it looked like the department grading its own homework. Either way, the headline was the same. Leadership knew the problem was not one locker or one team. It was how the system allowed certain units too much room to run. Chief Parks pulled the plug on Crash. He announced new anti-gang details with stricter entry rules and a heavier focus on experience. For years, Crash had been pitched as elite, but the badge polish had turned to rust in public view. Ending the brand was symbolic and practical. The symbol said the old playbook was dead. The practical side tried to cut off the pipeline that fed the scandal. If a name is toxic, you change the name, but changing the name does not fix every habit. The department still faced courts, lawsuits, and the slow grind of training people not to do what a small group once did. The sets in the street did not care what the unit was called. They watched to see if the tactics changed or if the uniforms were just new jerseys. The police commission brought in a civilian panel to run its own review. Lawyers, educators, business leaders. They were not in the chain of command. In November 2000, the panel dropped 72 findings and 86 recommendations. They said officers needed more and tighter supervision. They said the department undercut serious investigations after shootings and heavy force. They said the community saw the LAPD as hostile and confrontational. It was not a shock to people in Rampart's shadow, but it mattered that outsiders said it in clean print. That kind of report is not a courtroom verdict. It is a map. It showed every weak corner the cops had to shore up if they wanted any trust back, and it showed where the next scandal would grow if the fixes stayed on paper. Perez's partner on the Ovando shooting, Nino Durden, got arrested on attempted murder. The charges stacked up with perjury, filing false reports, and robbery. He said he was not guilty in November 2000, but the point was already made. The story Perez told was now a set of charges on a real docket, with a target who wore the same patch. This was not gossip. This was a system starting to hold its own to the flame. For people who had heard rumors for years, the case felt like proof. For cops who did the job clean, it felt like a sickness they want to cut out fast. Professor Erwin Chemerinsky put out an analysis of the Board of Inquiry report. He said the department downplayed the scale and the rot. He said culture allowed the dirt to grow, and the fix needed to be deeper. He pushed for harder independent reviews and a permanent special prosecutor to chase police misconduct. On the line, this sounded like a civil fight. In the hood, it sounded like power finally saying what people on the block had been saying for years. The department had hit a point where outside eyes were not optional. They were mandatory. Chemerinsky's paper did not send anyone to jail, but it put heat on City Hall to accept something bigger than a memo. The next move would decide if the LAPD had to answer to a federal judge. The City Council voted 10-2 for a consent decree with the U.S. Department of Justice. Reardon signed. Parks moved with it. The Board of Inquiry's 108 recommendations sat next to the independent panel's 86 and Chemerinsky's deeper cut. The consent decree did not answer every question. It did not fix every file, but it forced a choice. Either the LAPD would accept a mirror and change by track numbers, or it would keep arguing with its own reflection. The message was simple. Structure beats swagger. Oversight beats myth. That meant a federal judge would monitor reforms for 5 years. The Justice Department had been sniffing around LAPD since 1996. The deal meant no civil rights lawsuit if the city agreed to let the feds watch and measure change. Mayor Richard Reardon and Chief Parks did not like it at first, but the council's math forced their hand. Reardon signed in November 2000. A consent decree is not a headline grab alone. It is a set of rules and audits that grind day after day. Policies change. Data gets tracked. Early warning systems ping on bad patterns. For a lot of people who lived in Rampart's orbit, that vote sounded like the first grown-up in the room finally staying late. Detective Russell Poole filed a federal civil rights case against the city and Chief Parks. Poole was a lead on the Liga Gaines shooting and later worked the Rampart Corruption Task Force. He said Parks blocked his full investigation. From Kevin Gaines and David Mack to the wider misconduct in Rampart, Poole said reports were suppressed. He listed conversations and direct orders where he was told to stand down. He even said his 40-page report tying Mack to the murder of Christopher Wallace got shut. The department called his claims totally false, but the lawsuit put another crack in the shield. When a veteran detective says his own house stopped him, you get two choices. You prove him wrong with clean files, or you admit the walls are not just stained, They are load-bearing. The first criminal case off Perez's statements put Sergeant Edward Ortiz, Brian Liddy, Paul Harper, and Michael Buchanan at the table. The charges were perjury, fabricating arrests, and filing false reports. Perez did not testify. The DA did not want his credibility to stain the proof. On November 15, 2000, the jury convicted Ortiz, Liddy, and Buchanan of conspiracy to obstruct justice and filing false reports. Harper walked. It felt like the start of a new chapter, where courts would finally stamp what everyone was hearing. But trials do not end with a press release. Appeals are part of the street chess. That is what came next, and it blurred the victory line people thought they saw. The city council approved $15 million for Javier Ovando, the largest police misconduct settlement in Los Angeles history. Another 29 suits settled for nearly $11 million. The total estimate for Rampart settlements stood around $125 million. The city attorney called what happened to Ovando the worst case I have ever seen. That is not activist language. That is the city's own lawyer. They worried a jury would blow the number into the stratosphere if it went to trial. The payout came in 4 chunks over 30 months. For the public, this was the first time the city's money talked the same way the victims talked. It said something real and ugly happened. It also said the taxpayers would carry the weight for years. That is what dirty cases cost. They never end at the scene. They echo in the budget and the trust. A Superior Court judge looked into juror issues after the verdicts on Ortiz, Liddy, and Buchanan. She decided the jury had based guilt on a reporting point that was not presented at trial. She overturned the convictions. In January 2001, the new district attorney said he would appeal. This is where scandal cases cut both ways. The same rules that protect a suspect on the block protect a cop in a suit. If a verdict rides on a reason the court never heard, it breaks. For the city, the reversal felt like a bruise. For defense lawyers, it felt like oxygen. And for people watching from the neighborhoods that lived the worst of Rampart, it felt like the system bending back in favor of the badge again. Scandals do not end clean. They drip. Convictions overturned meant cousins and brothers came home. It meant the DA had to recheck anything with the certain signatures. It meant every case built by named officers looked shaky. Street lawyers told families to double-check old files. Public defenders pulled stacks and circled names. Judges learned the list by heart. That is how a scandal keeps living. It walks into court with 1,000 ghosts. It forces everyone to ask again and again if the evidence is real or if the evidence is acted out by a unit that wanted numbers and trophies more than truth. That question does not die easy. It keeps the door cracked for years. Perez's statements did not stop. He said he framed 4 Temple Street members in a Mexican mafia tax beef at a McDonald's on Alvarado. He changed the shooter's name more than once and stuck Anthony "Stymie" Adams with the trigger in an apartment next door. That kind of detail is why prosecutors and judges tore through old convictions. If the witness stand was built on crooked wood, you do not patch it, you tear it down. The city was forced to face more than 140 lawsuits. The courts tossed over 100 convictions tied to bad evidence or bad testimony. Each file had a name, a family, and time that nobody could give back. That number is not a stat. It is a story for every person who sat in a cell off a lie. In his recorded talks, Perez painted Crash as a crew with its own code. He said the motto was, "We intimidate those who intimidate others." He talked about a bar near Dodger Stadium where some drank and cheered the hits. He claimed most of the unit knew. Others saw that vibe and got out. The point is not the percentage. The point is the pattern. A tight clique with a scoreboard will always chase points. In the street, that gets people shot. In a station, it gets cases thrown out and a city on its knees. The independent review panel said the police commission was undermined and the inspector general was blocked by a lack of cooperation. City leaders were split. Some backed Parks. Others said he failed to act fast enough. Many pointed to internal affairs under his watch during key years and asked why warnings did not turn into stops. The consent decree made that debate less about opinions and more about metrics. The feds would now watch training, discipline, and data. No more guessing. Numbers would track who gets stopped, who gets hit, who gets charged, and which officers set off the early warning system. That is how you flush a set out of a station. You weigh the same things the same way every time. You make patterns visible. Then you either fix them or admit what you are. Chief Parks and Mayor Reardon pushed back on federal oversight at first, then moved with the council when the votes made it clear. The Board of Inquiry listed fixes. The independent panel listed more. Chemerinsky said, "Go deeper." None of those lists changed the past. Their only job is to block a repeat. If you grew up in Rampart, you did not care how many recommendations made it into a binder. You cared if your block felt less hunted by the same people paid to keep it safe. You cared if cops stopped playing like a set. You cared if the next kid in a wheelchair did not have to hear a judge say sorry after 2.5 years. That is what this scandal did. It made the city pick a side between spin and change. From March 1997 to late 2000, every month seemed to flip another card. By early 2001, appeals were live, reforms were a to-do list, and lawsuits were still stacked. A dozen lost badges or had to resign. That ratio told its own story about what could be proved and what could not. The DA had to move case by case. Judges did not want to hit a whole department with a sledgehammer and catch the wrong people. The street did not care about that nuance. People wanted the set inside the station broken up and every trick tossed, and they wanted eyes on the shop from the outside. The council had finally given them that. The rest would be slow and public. Kevin Gaines, Frank Liga, David Mack, Rafael Perez, Bernard Parks, Suge Knight, Nino Durden. Those names anchored the Rampart story because they sat at key turns. A shooting that lit the fuse, a robbery that showed a different hustle, a theft that opened the evidence door, a chief making calls and facing fire, a record mogul paying off-duty cops and sitting at the edge of a gang world with money and reach, a partner who stood at the center of a planted gun story. You do not need a conspiracy map with a red string when the same names keep popping up in clean reports and sworn notes. You just need time. Time is what the feds bought with the decree. Time is what the city paid for with checks. In gang life, there is a line everyone knows. You do not snitch, you do not fold, you ride for your set. The ugly twist at Rampart was watching a unit built to crush sets adopt that same mindset inside a station. When the task force and the feds finally lined up, the badge code lost its cover. After everything that went down between March 1997 and late 2000, what does it take to make sure a unit built to hunt sets never turns into one again? The next wave hit in March 2001, when the DA dropped felony indictments on 3 more Rampart crash cops, Ethan Cohan, Manuel Chavez, and Sean Gomez. The charges were straight grime for a unit that was supposed to clean up the streets, assaulting 2 gang members and filing false reports. Chavez and Gomez folded early and cut pleas with promises to cooperate. Cohan stood tall, pled not guilty, and waited for trial. The message was clear across Rampart's turf. The task force was still knocking, the paperwork was still stacking, and the crew was now getting peeled apart, one badge at a time. Who would flip next, and who would try to ride it out? 1 week later, Nino Durden took a deal with state and federal prosecutors and agreed to plead guilty to 10 charges that spoke the language of the scandal: fabricating evidence, false arrest, and false testimony. The deal put him on track for a 7 to 8 year sentence and forced full cooperation with the feds. With Durden talking, prosecutors had a new route to tighten the squeeze on Perez. And yet, in 8 interviews, Durden told a story that swerved away from Perez's bigger claims about unit-wide dirt. He confirmed planting guns, cooked up evidence, and perjury, but he did not back the idea that almost everyone was in the loop. On the Ovando shooting, he even pushed the blame for the drop gun back onto Perez. Same incident, 2 versions. Which one would the court believe when the next indictment landed? Juries would have to decide which voice to trust, judges would have to decide which files smelled clean, and the public would have to live with a timeline where the same names kept showing up next to the same kind of pain. After 3 years on a 5-year bid for the cocaine theft, Perez stepped out on parole in late July 2001. A judge signed off on a safety move that let him serve parole outside California. The informant life cuts deep in a city that still remembered the logos, plaques, and whispers from Crash. Perez was out, but not free. Parole is a leash, and cooperation is a target. Everyone wanted to know if his next stop was a quiet room with federal agents and a pen. By December 2001, Perez stood in a federal courtroom and pled guilty to civil rights and firearms charges tied to the shooting of Javier Ovando. He admitted 1 count of conspiracy to violate Ovando's civil rights and 1 count for possessing a gun with the serial number ground off. Sentencing was set for March 2002, with an expected 2-year federal stretch under the plea. The case that had already freed Ovando and cost the city a record payout now reached back to lock in federal time for the officer who said it happened. For Los Angeles, it meant the scandal was not just an internal mess or a state rap. It was a federal problem with federal time, and the calendar kept rolling. While 2001 moved fast, the fallout from late 2000 still rumbled underneath. A judge had already overturned the convictions of 3 crash officers after juror issues came to light, and the DA's appeal sat pending into November 2001. The DA also filed the new assault and false report cases against Cohan, Chavez, and Gomez. 2 pled out. Cohan pled not guilty. The split showed how messy it gets when a set's code collides with the courtroom. Some cut deals to save years. Some gambled on a not guilty and trusted the badge to hold. The pressure moved from the station house to City Hall. In 2002, newly elected Mayor James Hahn chose not to rehire Chief Bernard Parks. That call burned bridges in South Los Angeles. People said Hahn lost a key base over it, and that loss came back in 2005 when Antonio Villaraigosa beat him. The Rampart mess had become a political litmus test. How you handled it, or failed to, followed you into every room. Votes like convictions had a paper trail, and the scandal had inked everyone who touched it. That same year, a new show hit the air that felt too close to fiction to be anything but real. The shield dropped with a rogue squad of Los Angeles cops moving like a street crew with badges. It was so tied to the Rampart story that Rampart nearly became the title. The name changed to avoid beef with the department, but the vibe was the same. Viewers watched a unit play fast and dirty, and they saw the lines that get crossed when numbers and power matter more than law. The public did not need a courtroom to understand the blueprint. The show drew it in prime time. Back in 2003, the police commission and Chief William Bratton had convened the Blue Ribbon Rampart Review Panel, with Constance L. Rice at the helm. The panel took years to study, and by 2006 it pushed a public report. It was not a quick hit. It was a slow grind through policies, oversight, and culture. All the corners where a set can grow inside a department. The point was to move past the headlines and build a map that shows how to block the next crew before it forms. After all the hearings and payouts, the city needed something more than slogans and a retired logo. It needed a plan with the teeth. In 2005, the family of Christopher Wallace, the notorious B.I.G., filed a wrongful death suit that named the city of Los Angeles and tied Rampart officers to the murder. Detective Russell Poole believed Mack and Perez were part of a conspiracy to kill Wallace, tied up with death row records and the same off-duty security web that had shadowed the scandal from early days. Poole said his report had been suppressed and that orders from the top had shut him down. He quit the force and sued, saying his First Amendment rights were slammed to keep the story buried. If the allegations were true, the scandal was not just about framed cases or planted guns. It was murder tied to power, music, and law. Also in 2005, the LAPD rolled out a $35 million computer system to spot problem officers before the next Rampart erupted. It pulled together complaints, pursuits, use of force, lawsuits, all the data that used to sit in dusty files, and flagged unusual patterns. The Inspector General said the department needed computerized management. Chief Bratton kept it blunt. As long as you have police officers, you always have the potential for corruption. The system would ping a deputy chief when numbers looked off, and managers would decide the next step: more training, counseling, a transfer, or a case. Not everyone trusted it. The union warned that good cops might get tagged or that the message would be, stay in the middle of the pack. But after years of envelope culture, the department needed a hard counter to the set mentality. Numbers do not lie. They also do not forget. The Wallace estate filed another suit against the city that named Durden, Mack, and Perez. The allegation was deadly serious, a conspiracy to murder Wallace, with Mack and Perez on scene outside the Peterson Automotive Museum the night he was killed. 3 years later, on April 5, 2010, the family withdrew the suit without prejudice. Their lawyer said the only reason was to avoid stepping on a reinvigorated police investigation, and the door stayed open to file again. The claim never died in the streets. It kept a pulse in courtrooms, depositions, and newsrooms, and it kept the Rampart names chained to one of hip-hop's darkest nights. By 2009, the Harvard Kennedy School released a deep study on what the consent decree had done to the LAPD. It looked at data on crime, stops, complaints, use of force, officer surveys, community surveys, ride-alongs, the whole picture of a department under a federal microscope. The point was not PR, it was proof. Had the consent decree changed the way the LAPD worked? Was governance stronger? Was oversight real? Had use of force come under control? Had trust moved even a little? The study called it one of the most ambitious police reform experiments in an American city. After a decade of crises from Rodney King to Rampart, Los Angeles needed to know if the grind was working. Back in 2001, the DA's appeal on those overturned crash convictions was still waiting on a decision. At the same time, the office filed new cases against Cohan, Chavez, and Gomez, and Durden's cooperation was shaping future moves. After the early courtroom smoke starts to clear, the scandal muscles into Hollywood. So roll it back and watch how the screen told the story. Training Day landed in 2001 and put a dirty squad on screen that felt way too familiar to anyone who knew Rampart vibes. And the message was simple for viewers from the block to Beverly Hills alike. The line between cop and crew can snap clean when the numbers game takes over. In 2002, The shield dropped, and the creators almost named it Rampart, but they swerved to dodge beef. Still, the show rode the same formula. By 2004, the movie Crash flipped a road rage, shooting into a political hustle that mirrored the Kevin Gaines fallout. Cellular ran with bent LAPD cops for plot juice, and Grand Theft Auto San Andreas went straight for it, with 3 corrupt Crash officers and the motto spoken on the record: intimidate those who intimidate others. Dirty in 2005, Street Kings in 2008, Faster in 2010 with a cop revealed as a former Crash officer, and Rampart in 2011 with a lead who pays the bill for that era. All of it kept the same drumline beating in the background. Straight Outta Compton staged a blink and look twice moment when a cop was spotted with Suge Knight's People hinting at those old ties. Then City of Lies in 2018 brought Detective Russell Poole's Theory to theaters with Crash faces portrayed on screen, and a release that got stalled, which only made the whispers louder. The storyline kept the Rampart shadow alive in theaters and headlines. In February 2013, Christopher Dorner carried out a series of shootings and was killed during a police manhunt in Southern California. Before the hunt, he posted a Facebook manifesto that opened, "From Christopher Jordan Dorner to America, Subject, Last Resort," and told the public, "I know most of you are in disbelief," then called his path a necessary evil. He would partake and complete for substantial change to occur within the LAPD and reclaim my name. He said flat out, "The department has not changed since the Rampart and Rodney King days. It has gotten worse," tying his rage to the same dirty history our story exposes. County supervisors voted to build the Civilian Oversight Commission in January 2016 to oversee the Sheriff's Department and push transparency and accountability, a move that set the table for later hearings, witness lists, and cold-eyed memos that spelled out how deputy cliques could run a station like a set if nobody clocked them. The long history of deputy gang documentation kept stacking with the 2012 Citizens Commission on Jail Violence report, the Inspector General's look at the banditos, Loyola Law School's study, the Knock LA deep dives, and a 2021 RAND study, all building a file that said the problem was not a rumor, it was a recurring pattern that needed names, policies, and hard stops. In 2023, a 70-page special counsel report hit like a hammer and said flat out that deputy gangs and cliques still operate inside the Sheriff's Department at stations like East Los Angeles and Compton, listing sets like the Executioners, Banditos, Regulators, Spartans, Gladiators, Cowboys, and Reapers, and the investigators' line cut through the noise. They are a cancer. Witnesses told the investigators they feared personal and professional harm for themselves and their families, while a commissioner called the report 50 years of denial, obfuscation, foot dragging, and stonewalling, and that language sounded like a door finally getting kicked open after decades of locked room talk. The same memo said past administrations like Lee Baca's promoted tattooed deputy gang members to top roles, and the special counsel wrote that rewarding those insiders reinforced the power of deputy gangs and made reforms harder to land, which is how a clique becomes a system instead of a rumor. Witnesses told the commission they feared retaliation. A commissioner called out half a century of denial, and the report said gangs reemerge as older cliques retire, even sliding back into men's central jail, which is why the recommendations aimed at rotations, tattoo bans, and leadership screening read like a direct strike on the rules that turn a unit into a crew. Sheriff Robert Luna answered by saying he was elected to bring new leadership and accountability and created an office for constitutional policing led by a former U.S. attorney, promising attorneys, investigators, and auditors to help eradicate deputy gangs, while the Inspector General added, "We are going to start moving the culture right now," a claim that made some hopeful and others skeptical on site. At the hearing where the report was presented, the commission approved the document and adopted its guidance, then pushed the recommendations to Sheriff Luna with a do-it-now tone, and routed the package to the Board of Supervisors to meet their 2021 directive. And even supporters noted that paper means little unless station floors feel the shift. Also, in 2023, an LAPD gang unit at Mission Division faced rare locker search warrants served by Internal Affairs, with rumors that some officers had switched off body cameras during traffic stops and then switched them back on when making arrests. And the department confirmed a probe into gang enforcement detail officers, while the DA's office was briefed as the warrant stayed sealed tight. Inside LAPD, sources called the locker searches a once-in-a-decade move, the kind of step you do not take for a simple policy check, and the message was clear to anyone in a gang detail with the sloppy habits. Pretext stops and tech games are not just productivity tricks when internal eyes start pulling receipts. By July 2024, LAPD officer Braxton Shaw pled no contest to 6 felony counts for filing false police reports in a gang framing scandal. Prosecutors said he labeled 43 people as gang members who never admitted it, and some ended up in the Calgang database. And the deal set 2 years probation, a surrendered peace officer certification, and 250 hours of community service, with the judge still able to hit harder if he violates terms. The DA said body-worn camera footage from Shaw and partners showed the cards were falsified. And after the scandal broke, LAPD stopped submitting new entries to Calgang, with the chief admitting glaring inconsistencies and inaccuracies in how the department used the database and pushing to permanently halt participation. Field interview cards were used as a productivity metric inside Metro, and the 2020 analysis showed the division punched above its weight on volume, which meant officers had an incentive to rack contacts. The lights fade, but the echoes don't. You can still hear the boots on wet concrete, the radio badge crackle that turns a corner into a war room, the quiet code that made the badge feel like a set. On one side, a city begging for peace. On the other, a crew chasing stats like stripes, flipping street tactics into house rules. Courtrooms coughed smoke, files walked. Whole blocks learned to clock unmarked cars by sound alone. And every time the truth tried to surface, a fresh current pulled it back under. We met voices that won't forget. We saw how a logo can say what a report won't. We watched power talk in 2 languages, one for press mics, one for back seats. And when the mask slipped, the fallout didn't stop at one station, one patch, or 1 year. This wasn't just a bad Apple myth. This was culture with a pulse, hiding in plain sight, cashing checks the city still pays. So where does the scoreboard go when the crowd stops cheering? Who cleans a house that keeps rebuilding the same locked room? How do you kill a rumor that wears a uniform and answers roll calls? And when the hunters start moving like the hunted, who tells them the game is over? Let us know what you think in the comments box below. And if you liked how we presented you this video, hit that like button and make sure to subscribe for more.